Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Brendan Carr. I'm the CEO of the Mount Sinai Health System, and it's an absolute pleasure to moderate a panel this morning of some of our world-class experts from Mount Sinai. I'm going to start right next to me here and say this is Manish Arora. Manish is an environmental epidemiologist. His background originally was studying autism and biomarkers for neurodegenerative disease, and you'll hear how that has become something so much broader over the course of the panel. Next to him is Maayan Itzhak-Sadeh. Maayan is an environmental epidemiologist. Her background is primarily in cardiovascular disease, and specifically the intersection of the environmental factors, namely air pollution and cardiovascular disease. And Itai Klug is on the end there, furthest away from me. Itai is also an exposure scientist. His real domain of expertise is in geostatistics and really understanding relationships across space and time of the things that we are exposed to and that drive our health outcomes. So I'm going to take the first 30 seconds and say I'm not an expert in exposomics. We are going to assume that most of you are not an expert in exposomics, and I'm going to try to articulate through my eyes what this is, because it's both deeply overwhelming to think about, and it's also very straightforward. The things that we are exposed to in life drive our health outcomes. And we know that in a lot of kind of big picture abstract ways, and in some, sort of minute ways. We think about the way that we eat or whether or not we exercise. We think about the medicines that we take. And these guys think about the entire scope of things, beginning with the little stuff and also focused on the really big stuff, specifically climate change and the way the world is changing around us, both as a result of what we are doing and the man-made factors and all the other factors. So my sense is that we're at an enormous pivot point in the way that we think about health and disease and exposures and what that means with respect to health and disease. We spent a very long time thinking about the genome and thinking that was going to give us all of the answers that we needed. And we're now recognizing that the interplay between our genetics and the everything else is unbelievably complicated. So my sense is that we have never been at a moment like we are now, where we have the opportunity to be sophisticated enough to pull the data, to create these extraordinarily complex data sets, and to sort of disentangle the drivers of what's causing us to be healthy or not. So they're going to spend the next 5 minutes explaining why that was either right or wrong. That's the challenge for today. Can I start all the way at the end, Itai, and ask you to sort of paint a picture for us? Talk about climate change, talk about data sources, talk about how you pull that all together, because that, for me, I guess I can sort of conceptually get there, but it's too big for me to really think about.
Right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So maybe I'll discuss in a second exposure science before we dive into the data sources. So as exposure scientists, we take a look at the relationship between human health and the environment and environment contaminants. We take a look at the physical, the chemical, the biological, the social exposure, and we really want to see and investigate how do we get exposed. Do we get exposed through inhalation, ingestion, dermal, and what are the sources of these exposures? So is it man-made exposures, anthropogenic exposures, traffic, point source emissions from factories, or is it natural exposures? And there's a big difference in terms of how the exposures arrive. For example, in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, we have issues with dust storms, right? This is related to climate change, and depending on where the dust is coming from, it can have very different health effects. So if you have dust coming over Egypt, where it goes over the smelters and the industrial regions, it could be coated with toxicants, as opposed to dust coming from Saudi Arabia, Syria, making its way to the Mediterranean, which could have less severe health effects. So we really kind of investigate and apply novel techniques, machine learning, AI, satellite data, to take a look at how can we reconstruct exposures backwards in time that would affect human health using advanced technologies and use that in the realm of environmental epidemiology and other disciplines.
Yeah. How about just one more sort of click down deeper into that? how long have we been able to pull those data sources together? And
Right.
given where we are now, what does it look like over the next 5 to 10?
Right. So we apply a lot of kind of sophisticated methodologies to reconstruct exposures backwards in time because we're interested in what happens until a time of an event. It could be a hospitalization, it could be a birth, and so on. And we apply a mixture of hybrid methodologies. We pull in satellite data from NASA. We have a long-standing collaboration with NASA investigators. And we use the satellite data to calibrate with ground station data, allowing us to basically reconstruct backwards in time 25 years of exposures at the residence level. So we are able to tell you where you work, where you live, where you study, how many exposures and what levels of exposures are you exposed to throughout the life course. So we can go backwards in time, look into the past and reconstruct your exposures to climate change, to air pollution, to social determinants, and create a profile of your exposure going backwards in time.
Yeah. Maayan, can I pick on you next?
Sure.
So, for you, it's primarily been cardiovascular disease. Could you take sort of that big picture? We have all the data, and we want to understand what it does to your health outcomes and contextualize it, make it sort of something that I can bite into, an association between cardiovascular disease and exposure?
Sure. So we take the enormous routinely collected health data, and we can link this data to the novel exposure models that Itai just talked about. And we basically, in simple words, try to estimate how your address can predict your health. So we're focusing on cardiovascular diseases, and why we focus on these diseases, because heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States, and so it's very important to understand the causes of this disease. And just to put it in context, like the big picture, up until a few decades ago, most of the research was focused on genetics, right, to try and find a solution to health and longevity. But then we realized in other diseases, and in cardiovascular disease specifically, that beyond genetics and these classic clinical and behavioral risk factors, the environment has a significant role when it comes to cardiovascular disease. We now know that, for example, high air pollution exposure, extreme temperature, can increase your risk for stroke and for a heart attack. Now, in many of our studies, why it is so important to take the enormous data sources that we have, questions are more relevant on a population level than the individual level. If you take an individual and consider the risk factors for stroke, most of the pie will be divided between genetics and behavior, right? If they're smoking, if they do physical activity or not, a very small portion will be dedicated to the environment. Now, if you do smoke, for example, then you increase your risk for stroke by 60 or 61%. As a comparison, if you are exposed to higher air pollution exposure, you increase your risk by 3 to 15%. Does that mean that smoking is more important than air pollution? The answer is no, because if you zoom out of the individual and look at it from a broader perspective, which is what we do, and consider the fact that only about 11% are smokers, but 100% breathe the air, then you realize that air pollution is something that we need to focus on, and we do need to focus on the environment. And indeed, looking at it from this broader perspective, air pollution exposure is ranked higher than smoking in terms of contributing to the global burden of cardiovascular disease. So we have the ability to look at these different exposures as a whole in an exposomic approach, meaning that we consider the totality of the environment and still point out to these specific sources who are more important than others while considering these other exposures. And the bottom line is we can then use this information to inform policy and to direct interventions to the sources that contribute most to disease.
Yeah, but so at the macro policy, at the micro behavior change, we have spent a lot of time in healthcare talking about behavior change over the last 50 years. And before, of course, but it's a compelling narrative to say that the passive things, the policy things, where you don't have to make a decision, you don't have to change the unbelievable complexities of human behavior, could also carry with it an improvement in overall risk reduction. That's what I heard. Is that right?
Yes. So I think it is very important to people to perceive environmental exposures as risks, because right now, if you talk to a person with diabetes or heart disease, if they want to reduce their risk, they will likely to focus on these behavioral risk factors, right? Or maybe blame genetics on their condition. I don't know if the air pollution is the first thing that will come into their mind, but one first simple step will be to consider these exposures if you want to reduce your risk. And sometimes there are simple things we can do to reduce the exposures that we can control over.
Yeah, so Manish, going to turn to you.
Of course.
If we were at a genomics tipping point 10, 15 years ago, is this the beginnings of, is this the next big thing?
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking to an economist recently, and he said, well, you know, genomics contributed $1 trillion to the global economy, but now the question is, what's the next $1 trillion question? And I firmly believe it's exposomics, because as you know, I think as everybody knows, what makes us us is nature and nurture. Genetic tools were more advanced, so we focused on the nature part more. We could sequence the human genome, but now it's time to sequence the human exposome, and that's what we're trying to do. The moment you think of the exposome, the moment you think of nature, you come across this huge problem. In fact, when I was a PhD student many, many years ago, I was told it's an intractable problem, and that's the problem of time. I could take any of your saliva sample or a cheek swab, and I know what your genes are, and most of that genetic sequence is the same from the day you were conceived. But your environment, your exposome, changes all the time. So to engage the audience, I want everyone to think of this one simple question. What was your exposome at the molecular level? Not filling out a questionnaire, but actually getting something measured 6 months ago, 1 year ago, 10 years ago, or even before you were born. And that's what we wanted to do, to go back in time, build like a time machine, and go right from your neighborhood and societal factors down to what I do is measure things in a molecule, but construct this whole history. And that's why people said this is an intractable problem. How can we figure out what was inside my body years ago when blood turns over very quickly? So to give you the ending of this sort of journey was from a single strand of hair, now we can get information that would require, 5 years ago, would have required 1,000 blood samples collected sequentially. Now from a single strand of hair, we can do that, and you collect it at home. So when the COVID pandemic hit us, and especially hard in New York, and especially hard at Mount Sinai, it really just came to the fore that people can collect this sample at home. They don't have to come to the hospital for our clinical trials, for our research studies. And there was such a huge impact. And I'm very proud to say that together, you know, we are developing precision medicine tools that are impacting patients both at a societal level, like Mayan was saying, but also helping clinicians treat one patient at a time. For example, we developed what is the world's first biomarker for autism spectrum disorder that can detect autism as early as birth. I mean, the FDA gave us a breakthrough designation. They call this a technical breakthrough. So this is how exposome is now going from a theoretical concept to a place where it's very practically useful in our clinics. So it's becoming part of precision medicine.
Yeah, it's the second time you use that. It's interesting because I mostly think about precision medicine in the context of a therapeutic. Right? You just gave it a different flavor, which is to say, I can only get to the right therapeutic if I actually understand the entirety of the exposure and what you need me to intervene upon.
To add some more detail to that, this company that you would have all heard of, Novo Nordisk, they came to us. They said, hey, we have this product, it's a microbiome product, but we can't really figure out how it works, and none of our work with just genetics has given us enough answer to say this is where we point this compound. We said, okay, your trial is finished, but just go back and collect hair, because hair doesn't forget. Blood forgets, but hair, things are static. Things are logged in like a time capsule. So we analyzed the hair, and we found, yes, it's these pathways. And now they're saying, oh, okay, there's this subgroup of individuals in whom this works really well. And there's this other group of people who are very stubborn, and these pathways are very stubborn, but we have another compound. If we merge that compound with our existing compound, we have a new type of therapeutic, but it's it's only applicable to this subgroup. Now, compare that to what genetics has been very successful at, like precision oncology. We sequence the tumor and say, oh, it's this soup of chemotherapy.
Yeah.
And that's what we have done here. We sequenced the exposome and said, hey, this microbiome product needs this extra ingredient for this one subgroup. For this other group, it works fine the way it is. So clinicians can just say, hey, prescribe this hair test, or I want to know what your residential history is, so Ita and Mayan can tell you, you're living in a neighborhood that's actually very good for you. Things like that.
So, but it strikes me that, so the devil's in the details here on the methods, right? And what you just said, so when you go to medical school and you do a little bit of research training, you learn 2x2 tables and regression analysis, and you can disentangle simple relationships.
Right.
You guys have, you're not talking about simple relationships.
So things have moved on from 2x2
Is that
tables.
true? Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
I'll let Dr. Klug and Dr. Mayan talk about, sort of younger data science methods.
I can answer that.
Both of us, so please. I'll
So
Yes.
multidisciplinary. It's right. There's so many factors that are driving it. How do you get it? What we want to call causation.
Yes. So first, just to explain this, in our studies, the studies that we do are epidemiologic studies. It's not clinical trials. You don't isolate the main exposure of interest and control it for all the other things by design. You really need to make sure that what you think you're measuring is actually what you're measuring. So if we only took just one exposure, ignoring all the rest, we won't be sure that we're really estimating the effect of air pollution, for example, on stroke. The way to overcome this is to look at these exposures as a mixture, just as it behaves in our actual environment. And then we're able to disentangle this net, attribute risks to specific exposures, and not only that, we're able to rank these exposures in terms of how much each exposure is important in its contribution to the disease risk, and we can identify these bad actors that we need to take care of first to reduce the risk for disease as much as possible.
Can we start to model it forward? So if I did something over there. Yeah, that was a big nod, yeah. Please, it sounds like you know the question.
So yeah, I think to kind of add to what Mayan is saying, some of the methods are generating accurate exposures. One of the big issue with environmental research is really exposure misclassification or exposure bias, where we're assigning incorrect exposure. For example, in New York City, if you're looking at climate change and temperature, there's a huge difference between the urban core downtown or the Bronx and Central Park, where it's vegetated, and we see 2 to 3 degree centigrade difference between exposures. Or if we're looking at air pollution, let's say you look at Boston, we have one monitoring station in Harvard, which monitors air pollution PM2.5. If you live close to that station, you're going to get assigned correct exposure, but if you live far away, let's say in Newton, which is a few subway rides away, you live in a very rural area, no transportation, no industrial area, you're still going to get assigned exposure from the monitor and get high exposures, even though you're exposed to very low exposure. So our job as exposure scientists is to develop methods to really assign robust exposure. So what we do is we kind of reconstruct your exposures backwards in time using novel techniques. So we use satellite data, again, to calibrate our models, and thus reducing exposure error. We're basically creating these virtual stations. So we have a way to generate a virtual station at place of residence, and reconstruct your exposure to air pollution, to climate change, and other exposures, noise, and so on, as if you had a station at your house, minimizing dramatically exposure misclassification or exposure bias. Now, going forward, we're looking into techniques of predicting the future as opposed to predicting the past, using new methods of machine learning and AI, and using metrology and global scale models to also reconstruct going forward alongside backwards in time.
Yeah, but I have 2 things to say. One is that means then if I change my behavior or where I live or how I live or all the things, that I might change the trajectory of my disease. And then the second one is, it turns out I'm transmitting almost everything about me to somebody every day.
Right.
Is that part of this? Does that?
Absolutely. So part of the techniques that we use, we're actually starting to use wearables and drones and other kind of new methodologies to kind of ingest this geospatial information. We have these huge streams of information, and we're using geospatial techniques and methods to create platforms to curate, ingest, and validate, and then disseminate this information to our colleagues in environmental health, allowing us to better characterize your environment, characterize your daily patterns and your exposures throughout your life course.
So in our prep call, they started to talk to me about a piece of their work that was particularly interesting to me, and I wanted to ask if someone, or all of you, would pitch in to tell a little bit of a story about the World Trade Center and exposures following World Trade Center.
Sure. First of all, one of the largest centers that provides monitoring and treatment visits to World Trade Center responders is at Mount Sinai. And Mount Sinai collects information from all these centers. And we have information for, since 9/11 and 20 years later, including questionnaires and health conditions that responders developed over the years, and clinical measurements that they contributed to the study. And so this unique cohort allows us to investigate how exposures that they experienced during 9/11 and in the months after, in the rescue and recovery mission, how these affected their health years later. And so in this specific study, we were interested to know if the World Trade Center-related exposures increased the risk for cardiovascular and metabolic diseases, and whether or not the residential environment that they lived in 20 years later somehow shifted this risk. So we already found that those who were exposed to higher and more intense World Trade Center-related exposure now have a higher risk for developing diabetes and hypertension. They have higher cholesterol levels and higher blood pressure. And the next step will be to see if those who lived in a better environment, cooler and greener with better food options and more walkable and less air pollution exposure, if somehow these environmental exposures helped mitigating the risk that they were already exposed to, and maybe shift the trend of their cardiometabolic risk into a better one.
So this one's for anybody. I'm asking for a friend. I definitely know the answer to this. Are the exposures changing my genome? Are they changing my metabolism? Are they changing both?
I can start with the metabolism part, because in a way that's what we study. So if you think of your genes as one complex system, which it is, and you think of the environment outside your body as another complex system, how do they interact? How do they exchange information? They actually form a bridge. Our metabolism is one of those bridges. So absolutely, if you get exposed to certain things, it changes the way you metabolize. In fact, we found this amazing piece of evidence. We were studying identical Swedish twins in Sweden. And why Sweden? Because they have a very good system of always registering all their health information. And we found that even though they had the same mother, they were identical twins, so the same placenta, one developed autistic traits and the other one did not. And the reason was their metabolism started shifting, even prenatally. So the environment is the same, their genetics are the same, but the metabolism starts shifting. Years later, to answer your question more directly, when you study their genome, there's some epigenetic changes, because your genes can change by the addition of things like, I'm going into the technical details, like methylation. And those are heritable changes to our genome. And those are driven by the environment. So the environment can change your genome. It takes a long time, but even before it does that, it will alter your metabolism.
The way your genome is expressed.
The way your genome is working. So if your genome is the engine of the car and the environment is the fuel, if you start changing the fuel, your engine will function differently.
Yeah.
And so it has to be this very good interplay between our environment, our nurture, and our nature. And that's really what defines us as our health and our functioning.
So, I find myself thinking about targets and whether or not this is giving us new therapeutic targets, but let's put a pin in that for a second. And can I just ask something that's got you really excited right now? Something happening in your life? Oh, she's got the most exciting thing.
I'm excited,
Yeah.
of course. So, whenever I plan my studies, I always have, the possibility to make a change in mind. And one of the, greatest avenues for actually making an impact in our field is policy change. Any policy that relies on scientific evidence needs our research. Our research will be crucial to that, because these policies are based on cost-benefit analysis. And the health piece is a very large piece in these analyses. So for example, recently the EPA has decided to lower the annual national standards for inhalable particles. Just briefly, these inhalable particles you can breathe these through your lungs, and then they can transfer to different areas in the body because they are so small and cause a large area of diseases from cardiovascular disease, respiratory, neurological conditions, and so forth. And the EPA based on their scientific review, which included many of our studies, among other studies, which showed that exposure to air pollution levels that were below the national threshold at the time are still associated with higher risk of dying and higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And so they realized that in order to actually mitigate this risk, they need to lower the standards. And although I do see it as a success, we still have work to do because the current standards are still higher than the ones recommended by the World Health Organization.
Well, obviously I'm a modeler, so technology and the new advances, we're all talking about AI and machine learning, but really the new advances in satellite technology, there's a bunch of new satellites by the European Space Agency and NASA being launched with high resolution data coming in, streaming in, both temporally and spatially. And the new use of machine learning and AI enables us to develop new algorithms. So we develop a lot of new algorithms in-house at Mount Sinai, try to address some of these limitations in exposure science. For example, the monitors that we discussed are all centralized in urban cities because that's where the population lives and that's where the EPA and other agencies deploy them, and it's easier to target, but we're kind of missing out on the rest of the world, the rural areas. So we developed an algorithm called GMRF, the Gaussian Markov Random Chain, in-house, where we are able to predict better and assign exposures better in rural areas where we have very sparse monitoring networks. So we kind of apply these new exciting technologies into our research, and that really is what is kind of pushing us. Also the use of wearables and kind of mobile devices. These allow us kind of insight into individual level exposures, and we're kind of developing tools to really collect these data from large populations and use them in exposure science.
Anything getting you excited these days?
Me? A lot. Look, I'm a father, so I want to say something. I'm a father of triplet daughters, so that's a very special thing. Thank you. I'll be holding a hat out for college tuition at the back door as we end. There's another commonality. We're all parents, but there's something else that is common here, and we all owe a debt of thanks to one entity. And the common theme here is that we're all first-generation immigrants to this great land, right? And we all owe a debt of gratitude to the American taxpayer because you put your faith in us, right? You say, here, take our tax dollar and go out there and solve big problems. I've lived in 5 countries. I've been very blessed. Even in this political climate, this is by far the best place that I have lived, and I wouldn't raise my daughters anywhere else. However, what excites me is that I'm completing the loop. I'm not just taking anymore. I can give something back to the individual taxpayer now. And I'm just going to paint a picture in your mind. Imagine you get this little kit that I put together. It says, cut a piece of hair and send it to me. It has a little tag that one of our colleagues who isn't here, you can strap it onto your iWatch or your Fitbit and measures all your exposures inside your household. Because you're going to ship that kit back to me, you're going to give me your address, so Ita has the postcode where you live, and he can model all your neighborhood exposure histories, your air pollution, but also the good stuff, walkability, how much green space you have, and all of that information you can share with your doctor, and it is immediately actionable. We could tell you, hey, your house is full of this stuff that's not good for you. It's increasing the ADHD symptoms in one of your children. Immediately you can switch to a cleaner product, right? Or your hair is showing this metabolic disruption. We know this is the underlying cause. It might actually be an interplay with genes, as you said. Or once we're partnering with so many companies that have large volumes of genetic data, and we are partnering with pharma companies saying, hey, let's develop the next stage of drugs. So what excites me is not only are we working at a policy level where things move slowly, but there's a global impact, we have finally reached that tipping point where I can say, you know what, I repaid that taxpayer who put their faith in me, over this 10 years that I've been in this country. I hope I'm answering your question.
That one didn't come up in the prep call. So I wanted to go, the pin we put in was about interventions, and the reason that we do the work, in part, it's nice to admire the problem, or admire the disease, or admire the exposure, but what we would all like is to know what I can do differently moving forward. And so you guys have given tastes of that, flavors of that. If it's the World Trade Center, you said, the data's not done telling the story yet, but if you say moving to this kind of environment decreases the likelihood of this, health outcome that we're observing in people. I guess, just as this is where we all want to go. This is the reason we all, do what we do in healthcare, whether it's sort of way upstream, doing research, or downstream at the bedside taking care of someone. We want to make an impact. And so I've heard some of the flavors of those, but if there's any that need to be said, please, let's share them now so that people, Manisha's looking at me like he's like,
I can share one, or Itai, you want to go? If we already talked about the World Trade Center project, I think one important potential impact here is that currently federal funding for healthcare is only provided for certifiable diseases. And for the World Trade Center responders, these are mostly respiratory diseases and cancer. Cardiovascular disease and diabetes are not considered causally related to World Trade Center exposures. We already published one study that showed that we do find higher risk for these diseases, and we have another one on the way. And I think this can have potential benefit for these responders in terms of paying for healthcare. This is just one aspect for impact. You had another question about what we can actually do. So one thing is what Manish just mentioned, which that hopefully someday the exposomics will be included in the routine medical practice, where a physician will not only ask you whether or not you smoke and exercise, they will also try to estimate the exposures that you are exposed to. People can also keep in mind that they have the power to make some small changes in their daily lives to reduce their exposures to some extent. Even if they can't control the outdoor emissions, they can't control their indoor environment.
But if I've had a metabolic change as a result of an exposure, in my mind, there is then a new opportunity for a target.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm working now with almost 3 pharma companies in phase 2 clinical trials, saying, hey, this is a new type of platform. On one side, I really want to do what Mayan said. If I asked any of you, go change your genes, no, you can't. But if I said, make these tangible changes into your daily life, and I give you an easy pathway to do it, yes, we want to do that. We want to live our healthiest life. On the same side, I also work in a hospital. You're an ER physician. You see people at their worst as far as it comes to health. You want to be able to deliver a drug, a medicine, an immediate treatment. So we are now developing a whole new class of therapeutic that you can actually prescribe and say, hey, take this for the short term, the immediate condition that brought you to the hospital. But once you're healthy, we really want to maintain health. And you've all heard this, right? The reason healthcare is so expensive is because it's not healthcare, it's sick care. And this is the missing piece. This is why we have struggled to make sick care into healthcare, because we've never really educated our doctors and our patients to say, hey, these are changes you can make immediately. They're not more expensive than the other option. And here's how you do it. Make it easy. Make the healthier option easiest. When I was, I only had one shot at parenthood. It was all at once, triplets, right? It's not like I had a starter baby. I made lots of mistakes. By the time I got to the third one, I had, okay, now this one's going to, become the CEO of a hospital. So I decided, somebody told me, make the healthiest options the easiest. So I would put all the coloring books and everything low end, at reach level. I would put the less mentally engaging stuff higher up, because I wanted and that applies to all of us. If you make the healthiest choice also the easiest choice, and of course we would all do it. And that's what excites me. We're there now. We have all the technology. Everything is coming in. We are living during the golden age of medicine. Everybody's interested in health.
I have 2 things left. So first off, do we have a word for whatever this is? my entire exposure portfolio, all of my behaviors, right, all my inherited stuff, the way that my metabolism is being changed, that architecture, that framework, look, as a clinician, you know what I want? I want that like on the bottom left corner of my Epic chart, so that it tells me minute to minute what the outcome looks like for you. I want it on my watch to tell me that you're doing all right, but you can do a little bit more.
So I'll give two answers to that. One, the broader term is we are calling it exposomics. That this is the nurture parts from over your entire life. However, to answer that other point, which is actually the hard question, how do you make it so that the clinician in their busy schedule click on a button and it happens? We're doing a statewide testing program for Mississippi, one of the least resources states in the country. And that's what they asked us. So for those of you, my full-time job is really a professor at Mount Sinai, but also I spun out a small company, and we're all, in a way, affiliated with that startup company. And that's what we did. We developed this little software thing that you just click on the button, and the patient is referred to in this portal, and someone who has expertise in exposomics helps them fill out all this information. And now, because the pace of innovation is so rapid, we have an AI system there. You just talk to that system, and it charged on everything, including which day of the week does your kid not have soccer practice, so you can bring them in if there was a need to see someone like Dr. Carr. 5 years ago, we were talking about AI. Now we are talking to AI. So all of these innovations are coming together, and it's there. If you ever want to go to the hospital in Mississippi, it's not a nicely resourced hospital like we have.
Yeah.
It struggles, just keeping enough doctors there. We have built this tool to make things very easy.
And I think that the end goal is exactly what you stated. We're trying to build a full stack of exposures, from space up until your bedroom, of every level of your neighborhood, your house, your indoor environment, and kind of inform clinicians. We're building in Mount Sinai these platforms. We have a platform called Greener. We're putting all this data that's going to be available to clinicians. That's the end goal, basically, to provide the internal and external exposome to clinicians.
You've now referenced the fact that you're watching us with satellites, with drones, and in my bedroom. I want to ask a question about privacy and people's ability to swallow this, but we didn't cover it, so I'm wondering if it's taboo. But, now I've said it out loud. So where's that conversation?
I can weigh in because, again, I'm collecting molecular level data. A lot of this discussion has happened when we started, sending out our samples to get our ancestry. For example, I wanted to know, if I am the same, have you shared some common ancestors or something like that. So we gave away a lot of information, but there was a framework. Every bit of information that I get, we follow HIPAA rules, it's de-identified. So we're not really asking for, hey, here's your name and everything. Of course, we get that, but then it's stored in a certain way because we are a health system. We have to protect our patients, and so there's that framework. At the end of the day, for me as an individual, as a parent, there'll always be that balance. How much information do I want to put out and on what platform? I don't put my kids' faces on Facebook, but if a doctor wants information, I will share very openly because I have that faith in the medical system. I'll let my colleagues answer if they have something to throw on.
Yeah.
I use big data in my studies. In one of the recent studies, I included 65 million people across the United States. So we can't possibly reach out to each and every one. But like Manish mentioned, there are very strict HIPAA rules, and all the information is de-identified. So you can't really go back and identify who these people are. But still, with this little information that we have on, like the health information that we have on these people, the environmental information is so rich that we can reach significant conclusion even while maintaining confidentiality and the security of the data.
I'll just share a story that I was speaking with someone who works for a giant corporate entity and mines data to target sales, right? Because of course, and I said something about health data and protection and privacy, and he said, yeah, it's kind of tricky for us because I know how you eat based on the way my company sells you food, which means I know a lot about what your trajectory is going to look like, but it's not really health data. I'm getting better and better at my AI algorithms. At some point, it almost is. And, and he's not behind HIPAA. So now he knows me because, I don't know, because I put in my frequent purchaser number at whatever, the entity is that I'm buying food from. And now he's grinding on it in a way that's going to start to say things to insurance companies about my mortality risk. And it's not behind the HIPAA wall. It's interesting. So we're all out there. I presume all of you eat. Someone's watching and thinking about that data and what that means about our health outcomes. We are under the gun, less than a minute, so it's a speed round. I just wanted to bring us back to the fact that you guys are all connected, yes, to the exposomic world, but also to the climate world. And I just say, if there are top of mind, the one or two things that are the most impactful, most worrisome things about climate impact on health, I just would like to hear you sort of say them so they can think about them over the course of the rest of the...
Sure. So the consequences of climate change are already here. And I know Itai maybe can have a few more words about this. So the bottom line is we need to not only focus on preventing further worsening of these consequences, but also focusing on adaptation and preparedness strategies for the population to deal with these changes.
To add to that this is specifically critical to vulnerable populations. I mean, the effects of climate change in terms of air quality, kind of mental health, physical behavior, and a lot of other adverse health effects are well known, but specifically vulnerable populations, the elderly, younger children, pregnant women, people with disabilities, these are the populations that we really need to focus on adaptation and mitigation.
If I were to add just very briefly, I would also want people to know that we can make small changes ourselves in our daily lives, right? We of course need, effort at the government policy level, but every day we create a lot of waste. We choose options that are not good for our environment. We choose options that increase emissions, and we are getting to a point where we need to start making those little changes because it works both ways. If you reduce air pollution just a little bit, you're all healthier. But if you also do that, you change your lifestyle a little bit towards a less polluting lifestyle, and the air pollution reduces as well. So again, our relationship with the environment is bidirectional, and we owe that to our environment to make these little changes.
Fair, nice. Now we're ready. Boy, he's really ready. Thank you, everybody.
Particulate matter, which is designated as PM 2.5 or 10, depending on its how many microns in size it is, has been studied somewhat, but I rarely see any designation of what the particulate matter is made of. And I'm wondering whether that has been studied because, for example, when you're by a seaside, there's lots of particulate matter from the ocean, which is just salt, which just dissolves in your lungs, but when it's from vehicular traffic and rubber tires, et cetera. So can you unpack that?
That's a great point. And in fact, we do look at that. So we look at speciation of particulate matter and the different components of particulate matter. We even try to model that using novel techniques, looking at different properties of the satellite images, and then we obviously apply that in health outcome studies. And indeed, the different properties of PM could have different adverse health effects. For example, we're looking at transportation exposures. The difference between the morning rush hour, PM is very different in terms of composition compared to the background levels. We actually have papers published on that, looking at the different adverse health effects on, rush hour particulate matter versus background level or afternoon, and we see very different effects in that.
Yeah, but in my mind, that means that there's policy level changes about what the character is, which I imagine you're getting at, but also individual changes about I'm going to choose to not be outside during commuting time if in my region that's a more noxious time.
Yeah. Can I just add to that before you continue? We do have a very large study, the one that I mentioned that included 65 million people across the US, and we were able to quantify source-specific PM 2.5 exposure from oil combustion, coal, biomass burning, industry and traffic, and so on. And we did find that all the combustion and industrial sources were associated with higher risk of dying due to cardiovascular disease, but some sources were more riskier than others. In eastern regions, it was oil combustion who was most important, and in the west and southwest, coal combustion was most important. So there are differences depending on the composition of the particles.
Thank you so much, Maya. We got one right here.
You didn't talk much about our water supply, which is so dreadful. Do you have any suggestions for a home purifying system? I mean, besides the osmosis, which is a whole big deal, would you recommend something? And also, is golf dangerous because of all the pesticides that are around that you're breathing in while you're walking around?
So I'm not a golfer. I just don't have the time. Again, the triplets. However, again, having lived in war-torn Africa where there was no drinking water, to here, for the most part, actually, the US has a decent water. So the water coming out of your tap, most places, is actually pretty good. I do work on the Flint water crisis. I know situations where it has been terrible. It's been criminal, I'll just say it. And we are researching that. However, the solution has to be, one where everyone gets their clean water. So we have to invest in asking for the clean water supply. And that answers your second question about what is the best water filtration system in your house. The answer is no system, because your water should be clean enough that even the poorest person, the poorest suburb who can't afford a filtration system is getting excellent water. So, that's where we need to head, and that's where we need to push. We are heading into an election. That's where that's where we get a chance to push for these things.
Governor didn't even tell us not to drink it for 2 weeks because Okeechobee Lake was overflowing with algae. And then they said, don't even boil it because it becomes more potent.
I'll just summarize, because you didn't have the mic so people could hear. It's parts of the country, this was specifically in Florida, where there are, it sounds like, local challenges to the water, an overflow of a lake or an algae overgrowth that makes it more difficult. Yeah, it makes it harder. It makes people more inclined to have a local solution. I think one right up here, is that right?
I wanted to ask about personal care products like air fresheners and chemical sunscreens and that chemical soup that we're all kind of like using every day. And some people don't realize how bad those.
So again, one of the things we detect in hair, but also that variable I mentioned, are emissions from personal care products. And here's the thing, right? We can switch quickly, so no personal care product is equal to another. They're not all equally toxic. Ideally, you wouldn't want to use too much, right? But there are occasions when you do. But again, I want to empower the consumer to make the best choice, and that information is not there.
Well, what about Environmental Working Group, that website that kind of tells you about each person?
Exactly, that is there, but how user-friendly is that? Got to go through that list, and you have some options, but it's the whole thing. I mean, I spent a lot of time at Sephora. Let me tell you, before I had daughters, I didn't even know that store existed. However, I go there and I just think, hey, where is the quality of where is the exposome aspect of this? This is all about other things. So again, we want to impact the manufacturer, we want to empower the consumer, and the consumer should go and ask for those changes. There was a time when getting organic eggs was not in every supermarket. I remember those days, right? But now you get a choice of 20 because the consumer spoke up saying, we want this. And that's what you need to do. That's what my daughters will need to do, saying, no, I want a safer cosmetic product.
Manish, embedded in that, it sounds like the answer to your question is that we're not sophisticated enough to have the information that you want right now. I mean, is that unfair to say? It's not.
I think that responsibility falls on people like me to make that information palatable and actionable, to make it simple enough and say, hey, this is not good for you. We've done the analysis. Now there's an option. So you're changing, the impact on your lifestyle is not that much, but you are now making a healthier choice.
Like changing from chemical sunscreens to physical sunscreens, something like that.
Choosing a healthier product, just like we choose organic milk over non-or. So, again, we are still drinking milk, but now you still want to use some cosmetic products in your daily life. We can offer you a healthier option.
This is the challenge of being at Aspen, is that it's sort of the cutting edge of things, right? I mean, the consumer driving behind this has not gotten to make it easy to make good decisions yet. I mean, I think that would be my take home. There's two over here. Dealer's choice. We have time for both, I suspect.
Hi, my name is Jamie Clark. Thank you guys so much for this panel. One of my questions is around the exposures that's getting a lot of headlines. Microplastics keep me up at night. It's found in our food and our water in Antarctica. So are you studying that, and what is that doing to us?
I can mention it from the lab, the micro perspective. We are studying it because, again, microplastics is this big term. Come down to the little thing, just like air pollution particles, also the composition, what was in that plastic piece. In fact, it's even the shape of that tiny little piece of microscopic piece of plastic that can impact health. And we find it everywhere. We find it in placenta. We have a big placenta biobank at Mount Sinai. At delivery, we collect the placenta, and we're finding it there. So it's everywhere, you know. Honestly, you would have inhaled microplastic sitting here. You cannot avoid it. So we are working on that. And again, it has to be these, you know, consumer informed pressure as well as government policy that, you know, we as scientists inform.
I don't have anything to add to that.
There's one more right up front here, and then you guys are on a speed round here, so you see your clock.
Hi, thanks for all of this fascinating information. You all make a lot of reference to wearables. And since smartphones have become ubiquitous and wearables now seem to be almost there, aren't those wearables and our smartphones and whatnot exposomic factors, and what do you learn about what they're doing to us, if anything?
I'm just going to say, they had 40 seconds when you started. That's a good closer. That might take a...
Right. So I agree with you to some extent. It's not really my area of research. I will say that, as you mentioned, it's not just wearables. You know, we're entering the smart home kind of era. We have sensors all across, and it's something that we should definitely look into in the near future.
Yeah, it's hard. So, I mean, the last three questions actually, I think, are a great evidence of the fact that really what we're talking about here is a pivot in the way that we think about our health risk portfolios and our health portfolios. And we spent a long time getting really smart about disease and then about DNA. And now, you know, we're finally at this place where the data resources have allowed us and the data analytics have allowed us to start to dig into really disentangling the risks associated with everything that's in our life, from our smartphones to the water that we drink to the things that we smear all over our bodies. I'm so grateful for you guys being here. I'm especially grateful to the panel for giving your lives to this. If we would give them a round of applause. Thank you very much, everybody.